The oil lamp flickers against papyrus as an aging harbor master dips his reed pen one final time. His weathered fingers pause above the ledger, ink pooling at the tip, forming words that will outlast empires. Astarte's promise departed for western waters, cargo of purple cloth, crew of 12. The entry stops there incomplete, the pen abandoned mid-stroke, as if the writer simply vanished into the Mediterranean night. I am your DrowZy historian, and tonight we follow the ghost trail of a Phoenician merchant vessel that sailed from Tyre 28 centuries ago, carrying secrets worth more than gold into waters that swallowed ships whole. In our quiet reconstruction, that unfinished line becomes the doorway into a voyage whose ordinary details are easier to imagine than its ending. A ship prepared with care, a crew counted by name, and a western horizon that kept its answer. The harbour master's name was Melkar, though he appears in the records simply as keeper of the western keys. His handwriting, analysed by paleographers, shows the steady confidence of a man who had recorded thousands of departures over 3 decades of service. Yet something made him abandon this particular entry, leaving behind only the phantom outline of a ship that would become legend among the dock workers of Tyre. They whispered that Melkar never spoke of that autumn evening again, retiring to his modest home near the Temple district, where he spent his remaining years staring westward toward horizons that held no answers. The ledger itself, written in the flowing script of commercial Phoenician, reveals the bureaucratic precision that made Tyre the greatest trading port of the ancient world. Each entry follows the same format: ship name, captain, cargo manifest, crew count, intended destination, departure date. Hundreds of vessels documented with meticulous care, their fates recorded upon return in margins thick with calculations of taxes collected and profits tallied. But Astarte's promise appears only once, her story frozen in that moment of departure when hope still outweighed the vast uncertainty of the Western Sea. The papyrus bears water stains that suggest the ledger was hastily abandoned during some emergency, though no other records from that period mention unusual events in Tyre's harbour. A record like this, if it survived, would not need to shout. Its power would rest in the ordinary hand of commerce: ship, captain, cargo, destination, date, and then the silence after departure. Spring arrived early in the mountains of Lebanon during the year we now call 851 BCE, melting snows that had locked the cedar forests through an unusually harsh winter. In the shipyards near Byblos, master craftsmen emerged from their workshops to examine timber that had been seasoning for 7 years, waiting for a commission worthy of wood that had grown for centuries on the slopes of Mount Lebanon. The order came from Tyre: build a merchant vessel capable of carrying precious cargo to the farthest reaches of the known world. The shipwright chosen for this task was Abdmelkart, whose family had been shaping cedar hulls since the days when Egyptian pharaohs sent gold northward in exchange for the finest vessels their treasuries could purchase. His workshop occupied a natural harbour where the Adonis River met the sea, providing both the fresh water needed to season timber and the protected waters essential for launching completed ships. Here, surrounded by the aromatic sawdust of cedar and the constant rhythm of bronze tools against wood, Abdmelkart began crafting what would become Astarte's promise. Phoenician shipbuilding represented the culmination of centuries of maritime innovation, combining Egyptian knowledge of hull construction with indigenous techniques developed through generations of Mediterranean sailing. The cedar of Lebanon possessed qualities that made it invaluable for ocean voyages: natural resistance to shipworms, exceptional strength-to-weight ratios, and aromatic oils that helped preserve other materials in the humid environment of long sea journeys. Each tree was selected not merely for size, but for the grain patterns that would provide maximum flexibility in heavy seas. The construction process began with the laying of the keel, a single massive timber hewn from a cedar that had grown on the northern slopes where winter storms tested every branch for centuries. Abdumilkart's apprentices shaped this foundation beam using techniques passed down through oral tradition, measuring not with fixed units, but with proportions based on the natural relationships between a ship's length, beam, and depth. The Phoenicians understood that the sea demanded vessels built according to its own mathematics, not the arbitrary measurements of land-bound architects. Frame by frame, the skeleton of Astarte's promise took shape through the warming months of spring. Each rib was carved from selected cedar sections, then fitted into place using joints that relied on the wood's natural expansion and contraction to create watertight seals. Bronze nails, forged in workshops that specialized in marine hardware, secured the planking to frames in patterns that distributed stress across the entire hull structure. The shipwrights worked with an intuitive understanding of how wood behaved in salt water, crafting joints that would grow stronger rather than weaker as the vessel aged. The hull planking followed techniques that modern naval architects still study for their ingenious simplicity. Rather than overlapping like roof tiles, Phoenician planks were fitted edge to edge and sealed with a mixture of pine pitch and crushed shells that created flexible waterproofing capable of expanding and contracting with the wood. This shell-edge construction, visible in archaeological remains of Phoenician wrecks, provided smooth underwater lines that reduced drag while maintaining the structural integrity necessary for heavy cargo loads. By midsummer, Astarte's promise had acquired her distinctive profile, the graceful curve of bow and stern that marked her as a product of Phoenician yards, the broad beam that would provide stability in rough seas, and the relatively shallow draft that would allow her to enter rivers and harbors inaccessible to deeper vessels. Her single square sail, woven from the finest linen and dyed with expensive indigo, could drive her across vast distances when winds were favorable, while banks of oars provided propulsion in calms or contrary weather. The ship's name came from Astarte, the Phoenician goddess who protected sailors and blessed commercial ventures with prosperity. Her promise represented the hopes of merchants who invested their fortunes in cargoes destined for distant markets, trusting in divine protection and human skill to transform raw materials into wealth that would flow back to Phoenician cities like golden rivers feeding the sea of their ambition. In the wealthy district of Tyre, where merchant families built their fortunes on the organized chaos of international trade, Hiram ben Matanbal examined samples of purple-dyed cloth with the practiced eye of a man whose ancestors had been trading precious textiles since the city was founded. His villa, constructed around a central courtyard where fountains provided cooling relief from summer heat, served as both family residence and commercial headquarters for a trading empire that stretched from the Strait of Gibraltar to the markets of Mesopotamia. The house itself reflected the prosperity that Phoenician commerce brought to successful merchant families. Walls built from local limestone were decorated with frescoes depicting ships sailing toward distant horizons, while floors of polished marble from quarries in the mountains displayed the geometric patterns that would later influence Greek and Roman decorative arts. In rooms dedicated to business, cedar chests held samples of goods from every corner of the known world: amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, silver from Spain, and always the purple-dyed textiles that represented Tyre's most exclusive export. Hiram's family had specialized in murex purple for 4 generations, controlling every aspect of production from the collection of shells to the final dyeing of finished cloth. Their workshops, located in the industrial district where prevailing winds carried the pungent odors away from residential areas, employed hundreds of workers in the complex process of extracting dye from thousands of murex shells. The technique, guarded as carefully as any state secret, involved precise timing and temperature control that could only be mastered through years of apprenticeship under master dyers who passed their knowledge to selected successors. The purple industry of Tyre represented one of history's first examples of vertical integration in luxury manufacturing. Hiram's fleet of small boats harvested murex shells from underwater beds that his family had cultivated for generations, using techniques that ensured sustainable collection without depleting the populations that provided their livelihood. Shore-based facilities processed the shells immediately after collection, extracting the precious fluid that would be transformed through careful chemistry into the most coveted dye in the ancient world. Different species of murex produced subtly different shades of purple, from the deep wine red extracted from Murex brandaris to the brilliant violet derived from Murex trunculus. Master dyers learned to blend these natural variations, creating custom colors that commanded premium prices in markets where purple cloth served as both fashion statement and symbol of political authority. Roman senators would later wear togas trimmed with Tyrian purple, while Persian nobles paid fortunes for robes dyed in shades that existed nowhere else in the ancient world. The cloth itself represented the pinnacle of ancient textile craftsmanship. Phoenician weavers used wool from sheep raised specifically for their fine fleece, spinning thread to specifications that balanced strength with the delicate handling required for luxury fabrics. The weaving process, carried out on looms that were themselves works of art, created textiles of such quality that fragments discovered in archaeological contexts still retain their original colors after more than 2 millennia buried in Mediterranean soil. Hiram's current project involved preparing a shipment destined for markets in the Western Mediterranean, where Phoenician colonies were establishing new trading networks among peoples who had never seen purple cloth. The potential profits were enormous, but so were the risks. Ships could founder in storms, cargoes could be seized by pirates, or political upheavals could close markets overnight. Success in long-distance trade required not only commercial acumen, but also the courage to risk everything on voyages into unknown waters where profit and disaster sailed as close companions. The decision to commission Astarte's promise reflected Hiram's confidence that Western markets would provide sufficient returns to justify the enormous investment required for such an expedition. The ship would carry not only purple cloth, but also samples of other Phoenician specialties: glassware from Sidon, cedar products from the mountains, metalwork from workshops that had perfected techniques for working bronze and precious metals. Each item represented months or years of skilled labor, concentrated into a cargo that would either multiply Hiram's wealth or vanish forever beneath Mediterranean waves. Autumn arrived in Tyre with the gradual cooling of winds that had baked the city through months of summer heat, bringing the season when merchant vessels traditionally departed for long voyages that would carry them through winter in distant ports. The harbour bustled with activity as ships prepared for journeys that would not see them return until the following spring, their holds being loaded with cargoes that represented the accumulated wealth and craftsmanship of the greatest trading city in the ancient world. Astarte's promise occupied a privileged berth near the commercial center of the harbor, where the most valuable cargoes were loaded under the watchful eyes of merchants who had invested their fortunes in goods destined for markets weeks or months away. Stevedores, their techniques refined through generations of handling precious freight, moved bales of purple cloth with ritualistic care, understanding that a single damaged piece could represent more wealth than most men would see in their lifetimes. The loading process followed procedures designed to maximize both cargo capacity and vessel stability during long ocean passages. Heavy items like amphorae filled with oil and wine were placed low in the hold, creating a stable foundation for lighter but more valuable goods. The purple cloth, packed in cedar chests sealed with wax to protect against salt air and moisture, occupied the prime storage space amidships where motion would be minimized, and access would be easiest when the time came to display samples in foreign markets. Each bale of cloth represented weeks of labor by specialist workers, whose skills commanded premium wages in Tyre's competitive manufacturing economy. The finest pieces, reserved for royal customers and wealthy nobles, incorporated gold thread and precious stones that increased their value beyond mere textile worth into the realm of wearable treasure. These elite fabrics were individually wrapped in silk and stored in compartments lined with aromatic cedar that would help preserve their quality during months at sea. The ship's manifest, recorded on papyrus scrolls that would accompany the cargo, listed not only quantities and descriptions, but also the specific market destinations where each category of goods would be offered for sale. Phoenician merchants had developed sophisticated understanding of regional preferences, knowing that Spanish customers favored different purple shades than their counterparts in Sicily, and that North African markets showed strong demand for certain textile weights that were less popular elsewhere. Beyond the purple cloth, Astarte's promise carried a carefully selected assortment of other Phoenician specialties calculated to appeal to Western markets. Glassware from Sidon included both practical vessels and decorative pieces that demonstrated techniques unknown to local craftsmen. Cedar products ranged from small carved items suitable as gifts to larger pieces of raw timber that could be resold to builders in regions where quality wood was scarce. Metalwork included both finished jewelry and raw materials like tin and copper that were essential for bronze production in areas lacking local sources. The value of the complete cargo defied easy calculation, representing not only the direct cost of materials and labor, but also the accumulated expertise of craftsmen whose techniques had been refined over centuries of international trade. Conservative estimates suggested that successful sale of the entire manifest would generate profits sufficient to fund several additional voyages, creating the kind of exponential growth that had made Phoenician merchants the wealthiest individuals in the ancient world. Loading continued through several days as dock workers carefully balanced the competing demands of maximum cargo capacity against the sailing characteristics that would determine whether Astarte's promise could complete her intended voyage. Too much weight would make her sluggish in light winds, while improper distribution could create instability that might prove fatal in heavy weather. The ship's captain supervised every aspect of the loading process, drawing on experience gained through decades of commanding merchant vessels in waters where survival depended on getting such details exactly right. In the captain's cabin aboard Astarte's Promise, oil lamps cast dancing shadows across charts that represented the accumulated geographical knowledge of generations of Phoenician navigators. Baal-Shalim, master of the vessel and veteran of 20 years sailing Mediterranean waters, spread papyrus maps across his work table and began the methodical process of planning a voyage that would carry his ship beyond the familiar landmarks of the Eastern Sea into Western regions, where navigation required skills that separated master mariners from mere coastal sailors. The charts themselves were works of art as much as practical instruments, hand-drawn on papyrus prepared specifically for marine use and treated with oils that resisted the dampness that plagued all shipboard documents. Coastlines appeared as flowing curves marked with symbols indicating harbors, fresh water sources, dangerous rocks, and the seasonal wind patterns that could mean the difference between swift passage and weeks of beating against contrary weather. These maps represented proprietary knowledge accumulated through centuries of Phoenician exploration, closely guarded secrets that provided competitive advantages in the ruthless world of ancient maritime commerce. Phoenician navigation combined empirical observation with sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics, creating techniques that allowed their ships to cross vast ocean distances with remarkable accuracy. The North Star, called the nail of the sky in their language, provided the primary reference point for determining latitude, while careful observation of sunrise and sunset positions allowed navigators to maintain general easterly or westerly headings even during periods when clouds obscured the stars. Balshalim's navigation instruments included a bronze astrolabe of Phoenician design, its graduated scales allowing precise measurement of stellar altitudes that could be converted into positional information through calculations passed down through generations of master navigators. The device, no larger than a man's hand yet capable of determining location within a few miles anywhere in the Mediterranean, represented one of humanity's earliest attempts to reduce the chaos of ocean navigation to mathematical principles that could be taught and reliably applied. The ship carried multiple sets of charts covering different aspects of the intended voyage route. Coastal charts showed detailed information about harbors and anchorages where a start's promise might seek shelter during storms or take on fresh supplies. Ocean charts indicated the deepwater routes that offered the fastest passages between distant points, along with seasonal information about prevailing winds and currents that could either speed the voyage or create dangerous delays. Specialized charts marked the locations of navigational landmarks like distinctive mountain peaks or offshore islands that could be used to confirm position during daylight hours. Star charts drawn on specially prepared leather that would not deteriorate in salt air showed the positions of key constellations throughout the sailing season. Phoenician astronomers had identified specific stars and star groups that could be used for navigation, creating a celestial coordinate system that allowed skilled navigators to determine both direction and approximate position even when land was completely out of sight. These stellar references were particularly crucial for long ocean passages where ships might spend weeks without seeing any terrestrial landmarks. The navigation techniques employed by Phoenician mariners required years of training to master completely. Apprentice navigators began by learning to recognize the major stars and constellations, then progressed to understanding how celestial positions changed with both time and geographical location. Advanced practitioners could determine their ship's position by observing the height of specific stars above the horizon, using techniques that would not be significantly improved upon until the invention of the marine chronometer more than 2,000 years later. Weather prediction formed another essential component of Phoenician navigation, based on careful observation of cloud formations, wind patterns, and sea conditions that could provide advance warning of approaching storms. Experienced navigators learned to read subtle signs that indicated changing weather conditions hours or even days before storms actually arrived, allowing them to seek shelter or alter course to avoid the worst conditions. This knowledge, accumulated through generations of careful observation, gave Phoenician ships significant advantages in survival rates compared to vessels commanded by less experienced mariners. The planned route for Astarte's promise would carry her westward along the North African coast before turning northward toward the Phoenician colonies in Spain, a voyage that would test every aspect of Balshalim's navigational skills. The journey would require precise timing to take advantage of seasonal wind patterns, careful attention to weather conditions that could change rapidly in the western Mediterranean, and constant vigilance for the pirates and hostile vessels that threatened merchant shipping throughout the region. Success would depend not only on technical competence, but also on the kind of intuitive seamanship that could only be developed through years of experience in waters where mistakes were often fatal. The harbour of Tyre awakened slowly in the pre-dawn darkness, the ancient stones still cool from the night air while the first merchants began preparing their vessels for departure. Purple banners hung limp in the still morning, their rich dye catching the faint starlight that would soon give way to the approaching dawn. The scent of cedar wood mixed with the salt tang of the harbour, where ships creaked gently against their moorings as the tide began its eternal retreat. Balshalim stood on the deck of Astarte's Promise, watching his crew make final preparations for what would become their vessel's last recorded voyage from home waters. The loading had been completed during the night hours, when the harbour operated with quiet efficiency that would be disrupted by the bustle of daytime commerce. Amphorae filled with precious oils stood secured in the hold alongside bolts of the famous purple-dyed cloth that had made Tyre wealthy beyond measure. Cedar planks, cut from the legendary forests of Lebanon, lay carefully stacked and wrapped to protect them from sea spray during the long journey ahead. The crew moved with practiced precision through routines they had performed countless times before, checking rigging that would need to withstand the stresses of Mediterranean storms, inspecting the leather bags that held their precious supply of fresh water, ensuring that every piece of equipment was properly secured for the voyage ahead. These preparations, carried out in the dim light of oil lamps, represented the accumulated wisdom of generations of Phoenician seafarers who had learned through bitter experience that survival at sea depended on meticulous attention to details that landlubbers might consider trivial. As the eastern sky began to show the first pale hints of approaching dawn, Balshalim gave the order to cast off from the familiar stone quays of Tyre. The harbour pilot, an elderly man whose knowledge of local currents and hidden rocks was considered invaluable, guided them through the narrow channel that led to open water. Behind them, the great city began to stir with the activities of another day, smoke rising from cooking fires, the distant sound of merchants calling to one another as they prepared their stalls for business. The ship moved slowly through waters that reflected the gradually lightening sky, past the breakwaters that protected Tyre's harbour from the worst Mediterranean storms. Balshalim knew these waters intimately, every rock and current, every seasonal variation in wind and tide. This knowledge, accumulated through years of voyages to ports throughout the eastern Mediterranean, would serve him well during the challenging journey that lay ahead. The familiar landmarks of home gradually fell astern as Astarte's Promise turned her bow toward the open sea, beginning a voyage that would test every aspect of his seamanship. The route Balshalim had chosen would take them first to Cyprus, where they would acquire copper ingots that formed an essential component of Bronze Age trade networks. The island's copper mines had supplied metal to civilizations throughout the Mediterranean for more than 1,000 years, and Phoenician merchants had long maintained trading relationships with the Cypriot suppliers who controlled this valuable resource. The journey to Cyprus would serve as a shakedown cruise, allowing the crew to settle into their shipboard routines before facing the greater challenges that awaited them in the western Mediterranean. By the time the sun had fully risen, painting the sea in shades of gold and blue, Astarte's Promise had cleared the coastal waters off Phoenicia and was making steady progress toward her first destination. The morning breeze filled her square sail, pushing the vessel through waters that had carried Phoenician traders for generations. The crew, now fully engaged in their sailing routines, worked with the quiet confidence of experienced mariners who understood that their survival depended on maintaining constant vigilance throughout the voyage ahead. The waters off Cyprus appeared on the seventh day of their journey, the island's distinctive outline emerging from the morning haze like a familiar friend. The crew of Astarte's Promise had made this run many times before, carrying finished goods eastward and returning with the copper that would be transformed into tools, weapons, and decorative objects in workshops throughout Phoenicia. The approach to the Cypriot coast required careful navigation, as the waters contained numerous reefs and shoals that could damage or destroy an unwary vessel. The harbour where they would load their copper cargo lay on the island's southern coast, protected by natural breakwaters that provided shelter from the prevailing winds. Cypriot merchants had established their trading facilities here generations earlier, building warehouses and workshops that processed the raw copper into ingots of standardized weights that could be easily transported and traded throughout the Mediterranean. The relationship between these Cypriot suppliers and their Phoenician customers had been built on mutual trust, developed over decades of successful transactions. Loading copper ingots required special care, as the metal's weight could affect a ship's stability if not properly distributed throughout the hold. Experienced stevedores worked with Balshalim's crew to ensure that the cargo was balanced correctly, preventing the vessel from developing a dangerous list that could make her difficult to handle in rough weather. Each ingot bore distinctive markings that indicated its source and purity, information that would be crucial when the copper reached its final destination in Western markets, where quality standards were rigorously maintained. The copper trade represented more than simple commerce. It formed part of a complex network of relationships that connected civilizations throughout the ancient Mediterranean. Cyprus had become wealthy through its control of this essential metal, using that wealth to support a sophisticated culture that produced art, literature, and technological innovations that influenced developments throughout the region. Phoenician merchants served as the crucial link that connected these Cypriot suppliers with customers in Spain, North Africa, and other distant markets where copper was in constant demand. The process of loading took 3 days, during which time Balshalim and his crew also replenished their supplies of food and fresh water. The Cypriot port offered excellent facilities for ship maintenance, and the crew took advantage of this opportunity to inspect their rigging and make minor repairs that would help ensure their vessels' seaworthiness during the challenging voyage ahead. These preparations, though time-consuming, represented essential investments in the ship's safety that could mean the difference between successful completion of their mission and disaster at sea. As Astarte's Promise prepared to depart Cyprus with her valuable cargo, the crew looked forward to the next stage of their journey with the quiet confidence of experienced mariners. The copper ingots in their hold represented not just commercial value, but also the continuation of trade relationships that had sustained Phoenician prosperity for generations. The weight of this cargo would affect the ship's handling characteristics, requiring adjustments to sailing techniques that the crew would need to master as they continued their westward voyage. The second week of their journey brought them into the waters off Crete, where the weather patterns began to show signs of the instability that could make Mediterranean sailing dangerous during certain seasons. Dark clouds gathered on the western horizon, their towering formations suggesting the approach of weather systems that could bring strong winds and heavy seas. Balshalim studied these formations carefully, drawing on years of experience in reading the subtle signs that could provide advance warning of dangerous conditions. Ancient mariners developed sophisticated techniques for weather prediction based on careful observation of natural phenomena that modern meteorology has confirmed as reliable indicators of changing conditions. Cloud formations, wind patterns, sea conditions, and even the behavior of seabirds could provide valuable information about approaching weather systems hours or even days before storms actually arrived. This knowledge, passed down through generations of seafarers, gave experienced navigators significant advantages in avoiding the worst conditions. The clouds building over Crete showed the characteristic anvil shapes that indicated strong convective activity, suggesting the possibility of severe thunderstorms that could bring dangerous winds and heavy rainfall. The sea surface showed subtle changes in color and texture that experienced sailors recognized as signs of shifting wind patterns, while the behavior of dolphins and other marine life provided additional clues about changing conditions. Baal-Shalom weighed these various indicators against his knowledge of seasonal weather patterns in this part of the Mediterranean, trying to determine whether they should seek shelter or attempt to outrun the approaching storm system. The decision facing Astarte's promise illustrates the constant challenges that confronted ancient mariners who lacked modern weather forecasting capabilities but needed to make critical decisions based on their observations and experience. Taking shelter meant delays that could affect the profitability of their voyage, while attempting to continue in deteriorating conditions risked the safety of ship and crew. The copper cargo in their hold made the vessel less maneuverable than usual, adding another factor to Baal-Shalom's calculations about the safest course of action. The Cretan coast offered several harbors where ships could ride out severe weather, but reaching these refuges required navigating through waters that contained numerous hazards for vessels unfamiliar with local conditions. Cretan pilots were available to guide foreign ships through these dangerous approaches, but their services came at considerable cost and were not always reliable during severe weather conditions. The decision of whether to seek shelter or continue westward would need to be made quickly, as the approaching storm system appeared to be moving rapidly across their intended route. As the crew watched the darkening sky with growing concern, Baal-Shalom made the decision to alter course slightly northward, hoping to skirt the worst of the approaching weather while maintaining progress toward their destination. This compromise solution reflected the kind of calculated risk-taking that characterized successful ancient navigation, balancing safety considerations against commercial pressures in situations where perfect solutions were rarely available. The next few hours would determine whether his judgment had been sound or whether they would need to seek emergency shelter despite the costs and delays involved. The third week of their voyage brought Astarte's promise to the sacred island of Delos, where Phoenician mariners traditionally made offerings to ensure favorable conditions for the remainder of their journey. The island's reputation as a sacred site extended throughout the ancient Mediterranean, drawing pilgrims and merchants from many different cultures who sought divine protection for their various enterprises. The harbor facilities at Delos were well maintained and offered excellent shelter for vessels waiting for favorable winds or weather conditions. Religious observance played a crucial role in ancient seafaring, providing psychological comfort for crews facing the uncertainties and dangers of long voyages, while also serving practical functions that contributed to successful navigation. The rituals performed at sacred sites like Delos helped maintain crew morale during difficult passages, while the enforced stops for religious purposes provided opportunities for rest, resupply, and ship maintenance that might otherwise be neglected in the rush to reach commercial destinations. The temple complex at Delos housed shrines dedicated to various deities whose protection was sought by different groups of worshippers. Phoenician sailors typically made offerings to their own gods while also showing respect for local deities, a pragmatic approach that reflected their extensive experience in dealing with diverse cultures throughout the Mediterranean. These religious observances, though time-consuming, were considered essential investments in the success and safety of their voyages. The crew of Astarte's Promise spent 2 days at Delos, using the time to make necessary repairs to their rigging and to replenish their supplies of food and fresh water. The island's markets offered goods from throughout the Mediterranean, reflecting its position as a major crossroads for ancient trade routes. The copper cargo in their hold attracted interest from other merchants, but Balshalim declined several offers to sell portions of his cargo, knowing that better prices awaited them in the Western markets that were their ultimate destination. The religious ceremonies performed at Delos followed ancient traditions that had been observed by generations of Phoenician seafarers. Offerings of wine, oil, and precious metals were made at appropriate shrines, while prayers were offered for favorable winds, calm seas, and protection from pirates and other hazards. These rituals, performed with genuine devotion, reflected the deep spiritual dimension of ancient seafaring that modern observers sometimes overlook in their focus on technical and commercial aspects of maritime trade. As they prepared to depart Delos, the crew felt the psychological benefits of having fulfilled their religious obligations, while Balshalim had gained valuable information about conditions in the Western Mediterranean from other merchants who had recently returned from those waters. Reports of pirate activity near the Balearic Islands would require careful planning for the next stage of their journey, while news of good prices for copper in Spanish markets confirmed that their cargo would find ready buyers once they reached their destination. The departure from Delos marked the beginning of the most challenging phase of their voyage, as Astarte's Promise turned her bow toward the open waters of the central Mediterranean. The familiar landmarks of the Eastern Sea lay behind them now, and ahead stretched the vast expanses of water that would test every aspect of their seamanship. The crew settled into the watch-keeping routines that would sustain them during the long days and nights of open ocean sailing that lay ahead. The fourth week brought them into waters where few reliable landmarks existed to confirm their position, forcing Balshalim to rely increasingly on celestial navigation techniques that required clear skies and careful observation of stellar positions. The copper cargo had settled well during their voyage, and the ship's handling characteristics had stabilized as the crew adapted their sailing techniques to accommodate the additional weight. Weather conditions remained generally favorable, with steady winds that pushed them steadily westward toward their distant destination. Navigation in these waters required constant vigilance, as currents and wind patterns could gradually push vessels off course without obvious warning signs. The technique of dead reckoning, based on careful tracking of speed, direction, and elapsed time, provided the primary means of estimating their position between celestial observations. This method, though reasonably accurate over short distances, accumulated errors over time that could only be corrected by taking fresh sightings of known landmarks or celestial objects. The legendary tin sources that formed their ultimate destination lay somewhere beyond the western horizon, in waters that few Phoenician navigators had explored and fewer still had described in reliable detail. These mysterious islands, known to exist but difficult to locate precisely, represented the ultimate goal of their commercial voyage and the source of metal that was essential for bronze production throughout the Mediterranean. The exact location of these tin sources remained one of the closely guarded secrets of ancient commerce, known only to a select group of navigators who had successfully completed the dangerous journey. As Astarte's Promise continued westward through waters that grew progressively less familiar, the crew maintained their vigilant watch for signs of land, other vessels, or changing weather conditions that could affect their progress. The star-filled Mediterranean sky provided their primary navigation reference during night hours, while daytime sailing relied on dead reckoning supplemented by careful observation of sea conditions, bird behavior, and other natural phenomena that could provide clues about their position relative to distant shores. The mystery of their exact destination would remain unsolved, as the records of this particular voyage end with their departure from known waters toward the legendary Tin Islands that may have included Britain, the Scilly Islands, or other Atlantic sources whose precise identity continues to puzzle modern historians. The courage required to sail into such unknown waters, guided only by fragmentary reports and the hope of commercial success, reflects the extraordinary spirit of adventure that characterized Phoenician exploration during this remarkable period of ancient maritime history. The silver markets of Sardinia beckoned across the familiar waters between Sicily and the mysterious island, where mountain peoples had long extracted precious metals from deep underground workings. Astarte's promise adjusted course northward, following sea routes that generations of Phoenician merchants had established through careful observation of seasonal winds and current patterns. The purple fabrics that filled their cargo holds represented months of careful preparation in Tyre's workshops, where skilled artisans had processed thousands of murex shells to create the deep, lustrous dyes that commanded premium prices throughout the Mediterranean world. Sardinian coastal settlements appeared gradually through morning haze, their stone buildings climbing hillsides that rose directly from narrow harbors carved into rocky coastlines. Local inhabitants had developed sophisticated mining techniques over centuries, extracting silver ore from mountain deposits and refining it into ingots that met the exacting standards of international commerce. These island peoples maintained their own cultural traditions while engaging actively in Mediterranean trade networks, creating hybrid communities where Phoenician merchants could conduct business using established protocols of exchange and mutual benefit. The marketplace negotiations required patience and cultural sensitivity, as Sardinian traders evaluated purple textiles according to criteria that differed significantly from those used in Eastern Mediterranean ports. Color intensity, fabric weight, and weaving patterns all influenced final prices, while the reputation of specific Tyrian workshops could add considerable premium value to certain pieces. Trust between trading partners developed gradually through repeated successful transactions, creating commercial relationships that could span multiple generations of merchant families on both sides of these exchanges. Phoenician merchants had learned to establish credibility with distant peoples through consistent quality standards, fair dealing practices, and respect for local customs that governed commercial interactions. Gift exchanges often preceded formal negotiations, with small valuable items changing hands to demonstrate good faith and establish personal connections between individual traders. These preliminary ceremonies could consume several days, but they created the foundation for larger transactions that justified the time and effort required for such extended diplomatic commerce. Silver ingots emerged from Sardinian workshops bearing distinctive markings that indicated their purity levels and origin points within the island's mining districts. Local smiths had developed techniques for creating standardized weights that facilitated accurate measurement during trading sessions, while Phoenician merchants carried portable scales capable of detecting minute variations in metal content. The exchange of purple goods for silver required careful calculation of relative values, with both parties consulting reference materials that recorded recent price fluctuations in major Mediterranean markets. Provisions for continuing their westward journey included dried fish, preserved fruits, and ceramic vessels containing olive oil pressed from Sardinian groves that produced distinctive flavors prized by discerning consumers throughout the ancient world. Fresh water supplies required careful selection, as the quality of different sources could vary dramatically depending on local geological conditions and seasonal rainfall patterns. The crew of Astarte's Promise spent several days in port, allowing time for minor repairs to rigging and hull surfaces, while their captain completed commercial negotiations with multiple trading partners. Weather conditions during their Sardinian stay remained favorable for continued westward progress, with steady winds from the southeast providing optimal sailing conditions for vessels heading toward the Strait of Gibraltar. Local fishermen offered valuable advice about seasonal current patterns and potential hazards along the route to the Great Pillars that marked the boundary between the familiar Mediterranean world and the mysterious outer ocean beyond. These conversations revealed the extent of Sardinian knowledge about distant waters, suggesting regular contact with merchants who had successfully completed the dangerous passage to Atlantic trading posts. The loading of return cargo proceeded systematically, with silver ingots secured in specially designed compartments that distributed weight evenly throughout the vessel's hull structure. Purple textiles that remained unsold were carefully repackaged for presentation to Atlantic coast peoples whose preferences might differ from those encountered in Mediterranean markets. Additional trade goods acquired in Sardinia included distinctive pottery vessels, bronze implements of local manufacture, and small quantities of rare minerals that commanded high prices in specialized eastern markets. Departure from Sardinian waters occurred during optimal tidal conditions, with Astarte's Promise following established sea routes that would carry them past Corsica toward the distant strait where Mediterranean waters met the vast Atlantic Ocean. The crew maintained heightened alertness as they entered waters where piracy remained a constant threat, particularly for vessels carrying valuable cargo loads that could attract unwelcome attention from raiders operating from hidden bases along remote coastlines. The Pillars of Heracles rose from Mediterranean waters like ancient sentinels marking the boundary between the known world and realms of mystery that lay beyond the Great Strait. These massive rock formations, visible from considerable distances during clear weather conditions, had served as navigation landmarks for countless generations of sailors who dared to venture toward the edge of familiar waters. Phoenician navigators possessed detailed knowledge of local current patterns, tidal variations, and seasonal wind shifts that could affect passage through the narrow channel connecting two vastly different bodies of water. Approaching the pillars required careful timing to take advantage of favorable conditions that occurred only during specific periods of each tidal cycle. The strait's narrowness created powerful currents that could overwhelm vessels attempting passage during unfavorable conditions, while wind patterns changed dramatically as Mediterranean air masses encountered Atlantic weather systems. Experienced captains learned to read subtle signs in wave patterns, cloud formations, and bird behavior that indicated optimal timing for attempting the critical transition between two oceanic realms. Phoenician understanding of what lay beyond the pillars remained fragmentary and often contradictory, based on reports from the few navigators who had successfully completed return journeys from Atlantic waters. Some accounts described endless expanses of open ocean stretching toward unknown horizons, while others mentioned island chains, distant coastlines, and peoples whose customs differed radically from those encountered throughout the Mediterranean world. These conflicting reports reflected the genuine uncertainty that surrounded Atlantic exploration during this period of ancient maritime history. The psychological impact of passing through the strait affected even experienced sailors, as they left behind the familiar enclosed sea where every major landmark had been mapped and named by previous generations of navigators. Atlantic waters represented a fundamentally different environment where Mediterranean navigation techniques required significant modification to accommodate different star patterns, current systems, and weather phenomena. The courage required to venture into such unknown territory reflected the extraordinary commercial pressures that drove Phoenician merchants to seek new sources of essential raw materials. Religious observances took on special significance as Astarte's promise prepared for the critical passage, with crew members offering prayers to protective deities who governed safe travel through dangerous waters. Small offerings of precious items were cast into the sea at specific points during their approach to the pillars, following traditions that previous successful voyagers had established through trial and experience. These ritual practices served both spiritual and practical purposes, providing psychological comfort while reinforcing group cohesion during periods of heightened stress and uncertainty. The actual passage through the strait occurred during late afternoon hours, when favorable wind and current conditions aligned to provide optimal sailing conditions. The massive scale of the rock formations became apparent as Astarte's promise navigated between them, with towering cliffs rising hundreds of feet above the water surface and creating dramatic acoustic effects as wind and waves interacted with stone surfaces carved by countless centuries of natural erosion processes. Atlantic waters beyond the strait exhibited characteristics that differed noticeably from Mediterranean conditions, with longer wave intervals, different color variations, and distinctive patterns of marine life that indicated the fundamental differences between enclosed and open ocean environments. The crew adjusted their sailing techniques to accommodate these changed conditions while maintaining careful watch for signs of land, other vessels, or weather developments that could affect their continued progress toward distant tin sources. Navigation in Atlantic waters required modified techniques that took into account different stellar configurations, altered current patterns, and weather systems that operated according to principles unfamiliar to sailors trained exclusively in Mediterranean conditions. The North Star provided a reliable reference point for determining latitude, while dead reckoning calculations required constant adjustment to account for powerful ocean currents that could carry vessels significantly off course during extended periods of reduced visibility. The psychological challenges of Atlantic sailing affected crew morale in ways that experienced captains had learned to anticipate and manage through careful attention to daily routines, fair distribution of duties, and maintenance of optimistic attitudes regarding their ultimate commercial objectives. Stories of previous successful voyages helped maintain confidence during difficult periods, while regular observations of natural phenomena provided reassurance that they remained on course toward their intended destinations along distant Atlantic coastlines. Phoenician traders who ventured into Atlantic waters followed routes that had been established through decades of careful exploration and commercial development. These sea lanes connected Mediterranean ports with distant outposts where local populations provided access to raw materials unavailable through traditional trading networks. The distances involved required careful planning of provisions, water supplies, and emergency procedures that could mean the difference between successful completion and catastrophic failure of extended voyages. The southwestern Iberian coast emerged from Atlantic haze as a series of low hills and river mouths where Phoenician settlements had been established to facilitate regular commerce with local populations who controlled access to inland tin deposits. These outposts represented remarkable achievements in long-distance colonization, with permanent residents maintaining Mediterranean cultural traditions while adapting to local environmental conditions and developing productive relationships with indigenous peoples whose cooperation was essential for successful mining operations. Established trading posts along the Tin Coast operated according to carefully developed protocols that balanced Phoenician commercial interests with local political realities and resource management practices. These settlements included warehouses for storing processed metals, workshops for refining raw materials, residential quarters for permanent colonists, and defensive structures that provided protection during periods of regional instability. The sustainability of these remote outposts depended on maintaining positive relationships with surrounding communities, while ensuring regular contact with Mediterranean supply networks. Local tin deposits occurred in alluvial formations where ancient geological processes had concentrated metal-bearing gravels in river valleys and coastal plains, accessible to relatively simple extraction techniques. Indigenous populations had developed mining methods over many generations, creating knowledge systems that Phoenician settlers learned to respect and incorporate into expanded production operations. The collaboration between Mediterranean commercial expertise and local technical knowledge produced mining enterprises that benefited all participating communities. The loading of tin ingots aboard Astarte's Promise proceeded according to established procedures that ensured proper weight distribution and secure storage during the return voyage to Mediterranean markets. Each ingot bore distinctive markings that indicated its origin point, purity level, and the specific trading post responsible for its production and certification. These quality control measures reflected the sophisticated commercial standards that governed international metal trading during this period of ancient economic development. Silver acquired through Atlantic coast trading supplemented the Sardinian supplies already stored in the vessel's cargo holds, creating a diversified load of precious metals that would command premium prices in eastern Mediterranean markets where demand consistently exceeded available supplies. Additional trade goods included amber from northern sources, exotic woods from Atlantic forests, and distinctive pottery vessels produced by local artisans whose techniques differed significantly from Mediterranean ceramic traditions. The return cargo that filled Astarte's Promise represented months of careful commercial planning and successful execution of complex trading relationships that spanned thousands of miles of dangerous waters. Atlantic goods that were completely unknown in Eastern markets could command extraordinary prices from wealthy consumers who prized rare and exotic items that demonstrated their access to international luxury networks. These commercial calculations justified the enormous risks and expenses associated with extended ocean voyaging during ancient periods. Preparations for the return journey included careful inspection of all rigging and hull components that had been stressed by Atlantic sailing conditions, replacement of worn equipment with spare materials carried specifically for such maintenance needs, and calculation of optimal routes that would take advantage of seasonal wind patterns during the homeward voyage. Weather observations suggested favorable conditions for departure, with steady westerly winds that would provide efficient sailing toward the distant strait marking the entrance to familiar Mediterranean waters. The crew of Astarte's Promise had gained valuable experience during their Atlantic venture, learning navigation techniques and sailing procedures that would prove essential for future voyages to these distant tin sources. Their successful completion of complex trading negotiations demonstrated the diplomatic skills required for establishing productive commercial relationships with peoples whose languages, customs, and economic systems differed dramatically from those encountered throughout the Mediterranean world. Final provisions for the homeward journey included preserved foods that would remain edible during extended periods at sea, fresh water supplies sufficient for the entire crew throughout the anticipated voyage duration, and emergency materials that could prove essential if unexpected delays or adverse weather conditions extended their time away from reliable supply sources. These practical preparations reflected hard-won knowledge about the requirements for successful completion of long-distance ocean voyaging using ancient maritime technology. As departure time approached, the mystery of what unexpected challenges might await their return journey remained hidden in the uncertain future that lay ahead through thousands of miles of potentially dangerous waters, where weather, pirates, mechanical failures, or navigation errors could transform commercial success into maritime disaster. The courage and skill required for such undertakings reflected the extraordinary spirit of adventure that characterized Phoenician exploration during this remarkable period of ancient maritime history, when individual voyages could determine the economic fate of entire communities dependent on international trade networks for their survival and prosperity. The autumn winds that swept across the western Mediterranean carried more than just the scent of changing seasons. They brought the complex weather patterns that ancient mariners learned to read like messages written in the movement of clouds and the shifting colors of distant waters. For the crew of Astarte's Promise, now laden with their precious cargo of tin and amber, these seasonal transitions would have presented both opportunities and challenges that could determine whether their homeward voyage proceeded smoothly or encountered the kind of delays that transformed profitable expeditions into desperate struggles for survival. Ancient navigators understood that autumn brought its own particular rhythm to Mediterranean sailing. The summer's reliable wind patterns began giving way to more unpredictable weather systems that could shift direction without warning, creating conditions where ships might find themselves becalmed for days or suddenly battling storms that materialized from seemingly clear skies. The experienced sailors aboard Astarte's Promise would have recognized these signs in the way morning mists lingered longer over the water, in the different quality of light that filtered through clouds that gathered with new intensity, and in the subtle changes in wave patterns that spoke of distant weather systems moving across the vast expanse of ocean that separated them from home. Their heavily loaded vessel responded differently to these changing conditions than it had during the outbound voyage. The additional weight of cargo affected how the ship rode through swells, how quickly it could respond to sudden wind shifts, and how much strain the rigging endured when autumn gusts tested every rope and sail with forces that could snap inadequately maintained equipment or tear poorly secured canvas. The crew would have needed to adjust their sailing techniques constantly, reading the water and sky with the kind of intimate knowledge that distinguished master mariners from sailors who merely hoped their luck would hold through whatever challenges the sea might present. Navigation during these transitional months required different strategies than summer sailing. The sun's path across the sky followed a lower arc that changed the angles mariners used for determining direction, while shorter daylight hours compressed the time available for taking celestial observations that helped confirm their position relative to known landmarks. Star patterns that had guided them westward now appeared in different positions as the season advanced, requiring navigational adjustments that tested the astronomical knowledge accumulated through generations of Phoenician seafaring experience. The changing weather also affected the behavior of sea life that ancient sailors used as indicators of their proximity to land. Migrating birds followed different routes during autumn months, while fish populations shifted in response to temperature changes that altered feeding patterns and breeding cycles. These natural phenomena served as additional navigational aids for experienced mariners, who understood how to interpret the messages written in the movement of creatures whose survival depended on reading environmental conditions with accuracy that often exceeded human capabilities. As Astarte's promise made its way eastward through waters that grew more familiar with each passing day, the crew would have felt the particular satisfaction that comes from successfully completing the most challenging portion of any long voyage. The return journey through known waters, with valuable cargo safely stowed, and the prospect of reunion with families and communities that had waited months for news of their expedition's outcome. Yet this satisfaction would have been tempered by the constant awareness that maritime disasters could strike at any moment, regardless of how carefully plans were made or how skillfully ships were handled. The waters near Sardinia held particular significance for Phoenician navigators. This large island served as a crucial waypoint for vessels traveling the western Mediterranean trade routes, offering opportunities for resupply, repairs, and communication with other merchants whose own voyages might carry news between distant ports. The rugged coastline provided numerous harbors where experienced sailors could find shelter during storms, while the island's position made it a natural gathering point for ships following the established sea lanes that connected Spain's mineral wealth with the commercial centers of the eastern Mediterranean. It was in these familiar waters, where countless Phoenician vessels had passed safely for generations, that another merchant ship encountered Astarte's promise on what would prove to be the final confirmed sighting of the vessel and its crew. The master of this other ship, perhaps captaining a smaller coastal trader engaged in the routine business of carrying goods between Mediterranean ports, later reported seeing the heavily laden vessel making steady progress through moderate seas under favorable wind conditions that suggested nothing unusual about their situation or prospects. Such encounters between merchant vessels were common occurrences along busy trade routes. Captains would exchange information about weather conditions ahead, share news from ports they had recently visited, and sometimes coordinate their movements for mutual protection against pirates or severe storms. The brief meeting between these two ships represented the kind of routine maritime interaction that formed the invisible network of communication that connected Phoenician trading communities across the Mediterranean world. The crew of the encountering vessel would have noted details about Astarte's promise that seemed entirely normal at the time. The ship appeared to be well maintained and properly handled, with sails set appropriately for the prevailing conditions and no visible signs of distress or mechanical problems. The cargo appeared properly secured, the vessel rode well in the water despite its heavy loading, and the crew seemed to be managing their duties with the competence expected of experienced mariners engaged in long-distance trading expeditions. This final sighting became significant only in retrospect, when the failure of Astarte's promise to reach its intended destination transformed what had seemed like a routine encounter into the last documented evidence of the ship's existence. The details recorded by the witnessing crew would later be analyzed for any clues about what might have happened after their paths diverged, though nothing in their observations suggested any unusual circumstances that might explain the vessel's subsequent disappearance. The seasonal timing of this encounter added particular poignancy to its eventual significance. Autumn was traditionally the season when merchant vessels completed their final long-distance voyages before winter weather made such expeditions too dangerous to attempt. Families and business partners throughout the Phoenician trading network would have been expecting the return of ships that had departed during the spring and summer months, carrying the accumulated profits and exotic goods that justified the risks inherent in maritime commerce. In the merchant quarter of Tyre, where the families of Astarte's Promise crew members maintained their households and businesses, the passing weeks would have been marked by the kind of anxious anticipation that accompanied every homecoming season. Wives who had managed family affairs during their husband's absence would have begun preparing for reunions that represented not only emotional fulfillment but economic necessity, as the success or failure of trading expeditions determined the financial security of entire extended families. The harbour district would have buzzed with activity as other vessels returned from their own distant voyages. Crews unloading exotic goods, merchants calculating profits and losses, and families celebrating successful homecomings that contrasted sharply with the growing concern felt by those whose loved ones had not yet appeared. The rhythm of maritime life included these cycles of departure and return, but also the terrible uncertainty that accompanied vessels that failed to arrive when expected. Children who had grown noticeably during their father's absence would have been prepared for reunions that might include gifts of strange objects from distant lands, stories of adventures in exotic ports, and the restoration of family structures that had been maintained by mothers who bore the responsibility for keeping households functioning during extended separations. The excitement of anticipated homecomings would have gradually given way to worry as days passed without the expected arrival. The commercial implications of delayed vessels extended beyond individual families to affect entire business networks. Partners who had invested in cargo, suppliers who had provided provisions and equipment, and customers who had contracted for specific goods all depended on successful completion of trading voyages. The failure of a major expedition like that undertaken by Astarte's Promise could disrupt commercial relationships and financial arrangements that involved numerous parties throughout the Mediterranean trading system. Harbour officials who maintained records of vessel movements would have noted the absence of expected arrivals, while maritime guilds that provided mutual support for members' families during voyages would have begun the delicate process of determining when concern should shift from patient waiting to active investigation. The procedures for dealing with overdue vessels reflected hard-won experience with the realities of ancient maritime commerce, where communication delays and unexpected circumstances could extend voyages far beyond their planned duration. As weeks turned to months without word from Astarte's Promise, the emotional landscape of waiting families would have shifted through stages of hope, anxiety, and gradually dawning recognition that their loved ones might never return. The process of accepting such losses required enormous psychological resilience, as well as practical arrangements for the survival of dependents who had lost their primary sources of income and support. The Temple of Astarte, patron goddess of Phoenician mariners, became the focus for ritual responses to the growing certainty that the vessel bearing her name had been lost somewhere in the vast expanse of waters that separated Tyre from the distant shores where tin and amber could be obtained. The goddess who protected sailors, and blessed their voyages with favorable winds and safe passages, now received the desperate prayers of families seeking either the safe return of their loved ones or the spiritual comfort that might ease their grief. Priests who served the maritime community understood the particular anguish associated with losses at sea, where the absence of bodies and burial sites left families without the ritual closure that accompanied deaths on land. The votive offerings placed before the goddess's altar represented both pleas for intervention and attempts to maintain spiritual connection with sailors whose fate remained unknown, but whose prolonged absence suggested the worst possible outcome. The items offered in these desperate ceremonies reflected the personal nature of maritime loss. Small objects that had belonged to missing crew members, miniature ships crafted to represent the lost vessel, and precious materials that demonstrated the depth of sacrifice families were willing to make in hopes of divine intervention. These offerings accumulated over time, creating physical memorials to losses that might otherwise have left no trace in the historical record. The ritual responses to maritime disasters also served important community functions. They provided structured ways for expressing grief and maintaining hope, while reinforcing social bonds that helped surviving family members cope with economic and emotional challenges. The religious ceremonies that marked such losses became part of the cultural memory that shaped how Phoenician communities understood and responded to the risks inherent in their maritime way of life. Ancient peoples developed sophisticated psychological and social mechanisms for processing unexplained disappearances. The uncertainty associated with vessels that simply vanished without trace required different emotional responses than losses that could be witnessed and understood. The rituals performed in temples provided frameworks for managing this particular form of grief, while also maintaining the cultural values that encouraged continued participation in maritime commerce, despite its obvious dangers. The priests who conducted these ceremonies possessed deep understanding of the spiritual needs created by maritime losses. They knew how to balance hope for miraculous return with preparation for permanent separation, how to provide comfort without encouraging unrealistic expectations, and how to help families transition from active waiting to acceptance and adaptation. Their role in processing these losses reflected the central importance of maritime trade in Phoenician society, and the recognition that spiritual support was essential for maintaining the courage necessary for continued ocean voyaging. The temple archives that recorded these votive offerings created lasting documentation of losses that might otherwise have been forgotten. The names of missing sailors, the details of their vessels, and the circumstances of their disappearances became part of the institutional memory that helped future generations understand the costs associated with maritime exploration and trade. These records served both commemorative and practical purposes, preserving information that might prove valuable for understanding navigation hazards or weather patterns that posed particular dangers to merchant vessels. Years later, in the administrative centers where Phoenician merchants maintained their commercial records, the story of Astarte's promise would have found its place among the carefully preserved documentation that tracked the successes and failures of maritime trading ventures. The scribes who maintained these archives understood that each lost vessel represented not only human tragedy, but also valuable information about the risks and challenges associated with specific trade routes and seasonal conditions. The ledgers that recorded cargo manifests, crew assignments, and voyage schedules served as collective memory for the maritime community. They preserved details about vessel construction, navigation techniques, and trading practices that could inform future expeditions. The disappearance of Astarte's promise became part of this accumulated wisdom, a cautionary tale that reminded subsequent navigators of the ocean's power to claim even well-prepared and expertly handled vessels. The administrative records also documented the economic impact of maritime losses, the disruption of established trading relationships, the financial hardships experienced by investors and crew families, and the adjustments required in commercial networks that had depended on regular completion of specific trade routes. These practical consequences of vessel disappearances influenced decisions about future expeditions, insurance arrangements, and the allocation of resources for maritime ventures. The scribes who maintained these records possessed intimate knowledge of the human stories behind the commercial data. They knew which entries represented successful homecomings and profitable ventures, and which marked the beginning of long periods of uncertainty that often ended in confirmed loss and community mourning. Their careful documentation created bridges between the immediate experience of maritime tragedy and the longer-term process of learning from such losses. The lessons derived from unexplained vessel disappearances influenced the development of improved navigation techniques, safety procedures, and communication systems that might prevent similar losses in the future. The story of Astarte's promise contributed to this evolving body of maritime knowledge, even though the specific circumstances of its disappearance remained forever unknown. Future navigators who studied these archived records would have found in them both inspiration and warning. The courage and skill required for successful completion of long-distance trading voyages, balanced against the sobering reminder that even the most careful preparation and expert seamanship could not guarantee safe return from the vast and unpredictable waters that connected the scattered ports of the ancient Mediterranean world. The maritime memory preserved in temple offerings and commercial archives created a form of immortality for vessels and crews that had vanished without trace. Their stories became part of the cultural heritage that shaped how subsequent generations understood both the opportunities and dangers associated with the seafaring life that defined Phoenician civilization. In this way, the loss of Astarte's promise transcended individual tragedy to become part of the collective wisdom that guided future maritime endeavors through waters where mystery and possibility remained forever intertwined. The harbor master's oil lamp flickered lower as he turned another page in the ledger, his fingers tracing entries that had grown familiar over decades of recording departures and arrivals. Each line represented someone's fortune, someone's future, someone's family waiting at home. The incomplete entry for Astarte's promise remained there like an unfinished sentence, the ink now faded to brown but still legible in the wavering light. Below it, other entries continued the eternal rhythm of maritime commerce. Ships that had returned with full holds and profitable cargoes, their success measured in the careful notation of taxes collected and goods registered. But it was the blank spaces that held the deepest stories. The harbor master had learned to read the silences between entries, understanding how the absence of a ship's return created ripples that spread through families, partnerships, and entire trading networks. When Astarte's promise failed to appear in the expected season, other merchants had quietly adjusted their own ventures, redistributing routes and partnerships to compensate for the missing link in their commercial chain. The purple-dyed textiles that should have opened new markets in distant ports remained a theoretical profit, a calculation that existed only in the imagination of those who had invested in the voyage. The cedar planks from which the ship had been constructed had come from the highest slopes of Mount Lebanon, where ancient trees grew slowly in the thin mountain air, their wood gaining the density and resistance that made Phoenician vessels legendary throughout the Mediterranean. The shipwrights who had selected those particular logs understood wood in ways that transcended mere craftsmanship. They could read the grain patterns that revealed a tree's history of storms weathered and seasons endured, choosing timbers that would flex with ocean swells rather than crack under pressure. The bronze fittings that joined these planks had been cast by metal workers whose techniques had been refined through generations of trial and error, each fitting designed to allow the hull to move as a living thing, rather than a rigid structure fighting against the sea. When the ship disappeared, it carried with it not just cargo and crew, but also the accumulated knowledge embedded in its construction. The particular combination of cedar selection, bronze work, and rope tensioning that had made Astarte's promise seaworthy represented countless small innovations passed down through generations of shipbuilders. Each vessel that vanished took with it a unique variation in these ancient techniques, removing from the world a specific solution to the eternal problem of keeping wood and metal intact while crossing vast expanses of unpredictable water. The merchant family of Hiram had built their fortune on understanding which goods would find eager buyers in distant markets, developing networks of trust that spanned cultures and languages. Their success depended not just on the quality of their merchandise, but on their ability to gauge the shifting desires of foreign peoples, anticipating which colors and textures would capture imaginations in ports they might never personally visit. The purple-dyed textiles loaded aboard Astarte's promise represented months of careful planning. Negotiations with dye producers who guarded their techniques jealously, arrangements with weavers whose skills could transform raw materials into objects of desire, calculations of seasonal demand patterns in markets thousands of miles away. The murex shells that provided the precious purple dye had been gathered from specific underwater locations where the mollusks grew in conditions that produced the most intense coloration. Dye workers understood that shells collected during certain phases of the moon yielded different shades, and that the age of the mollusk affected the permanence of the color it could provide. Each batch of dye represented a small gamble on natural processes that could not be entirely controlled or predicted. The textiles soaked in these precious preparations carried within their fibers the accumulated knowledge of generations who had learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished truly valuable purple from the inferior shades that would fade or disappoint discriminating buyers. When Astarte's promise vanished, it took with it not just bolts of purple cloth, but also the specific relationships that had made those textiles possible. The dye workers who had contributed their expertise to the cargo would never learn whether their work had found appreciation in distant markets. The weavers who had spent months creating fabrics of particular weights and textures would never discover how their creations had been received by foreign eyes. The entire network of specialized knowledge that had produced the ship's cargo became incomplete, its effectiveness unmeasurable. The navigator who had guided Astarte's promise carried in his memory a collection of star patterns and wind signs accumulated through decades of Mediterranean voyages. His knowledge existed in the form of internalized rhythms rather than written records, an understanding of how certain constellations appeared at different seasons from different locations, how the color of water revealed the presence of underwater currents, how the flight patterns of seabirds indicated the direction and distance to land. This navigation wisdom had been passed to him by older sailors who had learned their craft through years of careful observation, each generation adding refinements to techniques that stretched back to the earliest maritime ventures. The bronze instruments he used to measure stellar positions and calculate courses had been crafted by artisans who understood the precise tolerances required for accurate readings. These tools represented a marriage of mathematical theory and practical metalworking, requiring both abstract understanding of celestial mechanics and intimate knowledge of how bronze behaved under the stresses of ocean travel. Each instrument carried within its design the accumulated wisdom of navigators who had tested and refined the calculations that made long-distance voyages possible. When the ship disappeared, it carried away not just these physical tools, but also the living knowledge of how to use them effectively. The navigator's understanding of how to read subtle variations in star positions, how to compensate for the effects of atmospheric conditions on celestial observations, how to integrate multiple sources of navigational information into reliable course decisions. All of this experiential wisdom vanished with the vessel, removing from the world a unique combination of theoretical knowledge and practical skill that had taken decades to develop. The departure from Tyre had followed rituals that connected the immediate voyage to the broader spiritual framework that gave meaning to Phoenician maritime culture. The offerings made to protective deities represented more than mere superstition. They embodied a systematic approach to managing the psychological stresses of ocean travel, providing crews with confidence that their efforts were supported by forces beyond human control. The specific prayers recited before departure, the particular offerings placed in sacred spaces aboard the ship, the ceremonies performed at various stages of the voyage. These practices created a framework of meaning that helped sailors maintain morale and cohesion during the long periods of uncertainty that characterized extended voyages. The religious observances practiced aboard Phoenician vessels also served practical functions, providing structured opportunities for crew members to discuss navigation decisions, weather observations, and equipment maintenance in contexts that encouraged careful consideration rather than hasty judgment. The daily rituals of shipboard life created rhythms that helped sailors adapt to the disorienting effects of constant motion and changing horizons, maintaining psychological stability in an environment that offered few fixed reference points. When a start's promise vanished, it took with it a particular variation of these maritime religious practices, a specific combination of beliefs and ceremonies that had evolved within the experience of that crew and that voyage. The prayers that had been offered for safe passage remained unanswered in ways that challenged the spiritual frameworks of those who had trusted in divine protection. The votive offerings that had been prepared for Thanksgiving ceremonies upon safe return remained forever unused, their intended purpose unfulfilled. The trading relationships that the voyage had been intended to strengthen existed in a state of suspended animation after the ship's disappearance. Foreign merchants who had been expecting the arrival of Tyrian purple goods were left to adjust their own commercial plans, seeking alternative sources for materials they had promised to their customers. The networks of credit and obligation that had been established to facilitate the exchange of goods across vast distances became complicated by the absence of expected deliveries, requiring delicate negotiations to maintain trust despite circumstances beyond anyone's control. The Phoenician trading posts scattered throughout the Mediterranean had developed elaborate systems for managing the uncertainties inherent in long-distance commerce, creating buffers of stored goods and alternative supply routes that could compensate for individual vessel losses. But each disappearance still created ripples of disruption that required careful management to prevent the collapse of larger trading networks. The loss of Astarte's promise meant that certain goods would not reach certain markets at expected times, forcing adjustments in pricing, timing, and partnerships that affected merchants who had never heard the ship's name. The families of the crew members faced the particular anguish of uncertainty that accompanied unexplained disappearances. Unlike losses that could be attributed to specific storms or known hazards, the complete absence of information about the ship's fate left relatives in a state of suspended grief, unable to perform the mourning rituals that would normally provide closure and community support. The wives and children of the missing sailors existed in a liminal space between hope and despair, maintaining households in anticipation of returns that might never occur, while gradually accepting the likelihood that their loved ones had joined the countless mariners who had vanished without trace into the vast anonymity of the sea. The economic impact of these disappearances extended beyond immediate family members to include the broader community networks that depended on successful voyages for their prosperity. The artisans who had contributed goods to the ship's cargo, the suppliers who had provided provisions for the journey, the investors who had advanced funds in expectation of profitable returns, all found their own fortunes affected by the vessel's failure to complete its intended circuit. The interconnected nature of Phoenician commercial society meant that individual losses created cascading effects that touched many lives in subtle but significant ways. The harbour master's records served as both practical documentation and inadvertent memorial for these vanished vessels and their crews. Each incomplete entry represented not just a commercial loss, but also a human story that had reached an ambiguous conclusion. The careful notation of departure dates, cargo manifests, and crew rosters created a form of immortality for voyages that had ended in mystery, preserving in official records the names and details that might otherwise have been forgotten entirely. Future generations of merchants and navigators would study these records not just for their commercial information, but also for the patterns they revealed about the risks and uncertainties of maritime trade. The accumulated data about vessel losses helped subsequent planners develop more accurate assessments of the dangers associated with different routes and seasons, gradually improving the survival rates of Mediterranean voyages through the systematic analysis of past failures and successes. The temple archives that preserved votive offerings from successful voyages also maintained spaces for the offerings that had been prepared but never delivered by crews who failed to return. These unfulfilled promises to the gods created a parallel record of maritime ambition and loss, documenting the hopes and fears that had accompanied voyages that ended in disappearance. The priests who maintained these archives understood their role as keepers not just of successful thanksgiving, but also of the interrupted prayers that represented the darker aspects of the seafaring life. The specific details of what happened to Astarte's promise remained forever unknown, but the impact of its loss continued to influence Phoenician maritime culture long after the last realistic hope of the ship's return had faded. The mystery of its disappearance became part of the folklore that shaped how subsequent generations understood both the possibilities and the perils of ocean travel, contributing to a body of cautionary wisdom that influenced navigation decisions, route planning, and crew training for centuries to come. The cedar planks that had formed the ship's hull eventually returned to the sea in ways that could not be documented or observed, becoming part of the vast circulation of materials that connected all Mediterranean waters. The bronze fittings that had held the vessel together gradually corroded and settled into sediments that would preserve their chemical signatures long after their original forms had dissolved. The purple-dyed textiles that had represented such concentrated value slowly released their colors into the surrounding water, their precious pigments dispersing into the same medium that had once carried them toward distant markets. The knowledge and skills that had been embodied in the ship's crew found new expressions in the training of subsequent navigators and merchants, passed along through the networks of maritime education that connected Phoenician ports throughout the ancient world. While the specific combination of experience and expertise that had sailed aboard Astarte's promise was lost forever, the broader traditions of seamanship and commerce continued to evolve, incorporating lessons learned from both successes and failures into an ever-expanding body of practical wisdom. The story of the ship that never came home became part of the larger narrative of human ambition and uncertainty that characterized the ancient Mediterranean world, where the pursuit of profit and adventure required constant negotiations with forces beyond human control or prediction. In the quiet hours when harbor masters reviewed their ledgers and merchants calculated risks for future voyages, the memory of Astarte's promise served as a reminder that even the most careful planning and expert execution could not guarantee safe passage through waters where mystery and possibility remained forever intertwined with danger and loss. Tomorrow night we might drift together through the mountain passes where Roman messengers carried news that would reshape empires, their leather satchels holding dispatches that connected distant frontiers to the beating heart of imperial power, racing against time and weather to deliver words that could determine the fate of nations.